Well, the mount for the interface went in there real nice, and like the way that turned out. But I took it out and I modified it a little bit. I've got this switch, this air switch for the Hobbs meter, and I went ahead and piggybacked that on that mount. Had to take it out and drill a couple holes in it, countersunk them for flathead screws, and then mounted it on here. The purpose of this air switch, it takes pitot air, air pressure, and it operates the switch for the Hobbs meter. And the theory behind that is that these airplanes, when you're flying commercially, the life parts of them, the hour parts like the engine, propeller, things like that, the hours on them add up for overhaul and maintenance is flight hours and not ground hours. So by putting a Hobbs meter in there that's switched to the pitot tube, this one I think is switches on at about 20 miles an hour or so, then ground run up, taxi, things like that don't count for your engine hours, and theoretically it would increase the calendar time, or the amount of time that you would put on your engine or your life limited parts before they need to be overhauled or replaced. I haven't really noticed much of a difference between that and the tack time. It varies back and forth depending on what I'm doing, but like when I'm flying at a lower RPM and stuff, the tack rolls over slow anyway, and so I end up putting more time on the Hobbs meter than you do on the tack. But it's supposed to work probably for most people over a long period of time. It might save a few hours or something, increase the amount of time that you can use a life limited part by a few hours. So I'm looking for how to mount this shunt for the ammeter, and it is already, this is the mount that it came with, and this is kind of the way it was mounted on the other airframe. Oh, I was thinking about trying to adapt it onto this mount that I put on for the interface or something, but I looked, and anyway, I just went ahead and mounted it like this. It mounts parallel on there with the interface, and that looks like it's going to mount up okay. So I'm going to have to switch the shunt around so that the battery lead off of the shunt comes off of this front end instead of, right now it's it was probably turned around the other way or mounted different in the other airframe, but anyway, the battery lead here is off the front. I'm going to switch it around and bring it off the back, probably trim off up some of these corners and stuff a little bit, and then bring the battery lead out over here and down that side, the fuselage. It'll go down underneath the floor and come up on the seat there where the battery is going to be mounted underneath the front seat. There's a shield, a cover that goes over the shunt, over the terminals of the shunt, so it doesn't, the battery terminals here, so it doesn't get banged or anything. That I'll go ahead and clean it up and powder coat it, and then we'll install it just like that. I think that looks pretty good. This is the mount that the shunt for the ammeter was mounted on in the other airframe. There's nothing wrong with it. I modified it a little bit, took the sharp corners off of it, rounded it off a little bit, and then set it up to mount it in this airframe. Then I went ahead and took it down to the shop, sandblasted it, and powder coated it. I'd taken the shunt off of it, demounted the shunt from it. I took some paint thinner and cleaned up this wire harness. It had grease and paint and stuff on it, and got it pretty well cleaned up. Still had a little bit of paint on it like here, and I took a little bit of lacquer thinner and washed it down real good, got it all cleaned up. I'll go ahead and mount this shunt back in the mount, and then put the mount in the airframe. I just use these, what are these, AN 742, these are 10s, clamps, and I put some nut zerts in them to use to put on that X-brace, and then just run screws in there to mount this, put this mount on. I've got the shunt mounted into the mount here and wired up, and then I put the lead on it for the ammeter, and the shunt, this lead here goes to the battery, and this lead here goes to the ignition switch, which goes to the alternator, and then this is goes to the ammeter. And we've got it wired up with the red lead going on the ammeter side, on the alternator side, and the black lead going to the battery side. Now the ammeter doesn't really care, these wires don't really care which side they're hooked up on. There's no diodes in them or anything to run the current any one direction. And the ammeter, as far as that goes, doesn't really care which way the current runs through it. But if you're trying to read the ammeter, if you had these reversed, if you had the negative on the battery or the alternator side and the positive on the battery side, then when it was running, or if you had a discharge, it would read the other direction. It would show discharge going to the right or going to the left instead of the right, and so it just read backwards on there. So this way it should read right when the alternator is working and it's charging the battery, or there's a positive current flow from the alternator, then it'll go to the plus side. And if there's a negative flow from the alternator, or if there's a flow coming from the battery, then it would show a discharge or go to the left. So these are the original cables that were in there, put all back in. So this one goes to the ammeter. I might have to replace this cable, the one here that comes out goes to the switch. It's going to be in a little different spot than it was in the other airframe, and it might just be a little bit too short. Okay, there's the alternator shunt mounted up there, nice to that cross beam, all set up. Now, as I was afraid, this wire here is a little shorter than what I wanted. This goes to the switch, the main breaker, alternator breaker. I've got the big wire for the battery I bought new, figuring I was going to have to run new wire from the battery to the starter. Looking at the starter cable that I've got, it doesn't look like I'm going to need that, but I didn't get any of this wire here. I've got plenty going down here to where the battery is going to be, because we're going to move the battery up to the underneath the front seat instead of back underneath the back seat, so there'll be plenty of that. But anyway, we got the shunt mounted in. That looks pretty good.